Earlier that evening, I had noticed Addison's phone left unattended on the kitchen counter, the screen still glowing with a new message notification. My heart sank as I hesitated, torn between respecting her privacy and the growing unease that had been gnawing at me for weeks. Finally, my curiosity, or perhaps my fear, got the better of me. I picked up the phone, my fingers trembling as I swiped open the message. That's when I saw it. Wyatt's name, followed by words that shattered everything I thought I knew about our marriage. I quickly grabbed my own phone and snapped a photo of the screen, the evidence now safely stored in my device. I placed Addison's phone back on the counter, my hands shaking, my mind racing. I couldn't confront her yet. Not until I had time to process what I'd just seen. The clock ticked past 11 p.m. in our dimly lit living room. My fingers, restless and trembling, tapped at the screen, replaying our last messages. The blue glow of my phone cast long shadows across the room. Wyatt's text was stark against the darkness. "I'm happy I got to see you again tonight." A small heart emoji tacked onto the end, followed by a photo of the restaurant, the same one. A typical Tuesday, really. Addison predictably running late, claiming overtime. I stared at the rain-streaked windows. The San Francisco skyline was just a blurry smear of neon against the night. The sound of the front door banging open startled me. Rushed footsteps, too fast, too frantic. Normally, I'd meet my wife with a warm greeting, but tonight felt different, thick with tension. It felt as if 5 years of carefully constructed happiness in this high-rise apartment were teetering, threatening to collapse around me. "I'm home." Addison's voice was hesitant, even a little choked, sensing the heavy atmosphere in the room. Her footsteps drew closer, and she finally stepped into the living room, a silhouette framed by the muted city lights in her elegant dress. "Asher, you're still up?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I remained silent, holding up my phone, the screen still illuminated with the text from Wyatt. I watched as the blood drained from her face, her eyes widened, and her breath hitched in her throat. "This?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Addison's purse slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor as she sank onto the couch. Her blonde hair fell over her face, concealing her expression. "Asher, she began, her voice shaking. "When did it start?" My question was short, sharp, a distant tone she'd never heard from me in the last 5 years. She wrapped her arms around herself, her shoulders shaking slightly. "It started 3 months ago." Her voice was so soft, it barely carried across the room. "When you started working in the hospital finance department," I stated, my voice flat. She nodded faintly, avoiding my gaze. Setting down the phone on the small table beside me, I reached for a glass of whiskey. The ice had almost melted, leaving the amber liquid slightly diluted and bitter on my tongue as I took a sip. "Twice a week. Tuesday and Friday nights," I stated, the words coming out calmly, but the tremor in my voice betrayed my internal state. "The dinners I prepared for you went cold, waiting for you every single night," I added, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. Her shoulders began to shake more violently now. She covered her face with her hands and started to sob softly, a sound that felt all wrong, not like the Addison I knew. God, Asher, I'm so sorry. Why? I asked, cutting her off, the question heavy with the pain I was feeling. As I stood, Addison recoiled slightly, as if she were afraid of me. I placed the now empty glass down on the windowside table. The rain was pounding harder now, drumming against the glass like a soundtrack to the unraveling of my life. The blurred reflections of the city lights stirred old memories. Our wedding day, the day we moved into this apartment, the quiet night spent looking up at the stars. Everything we'd built together was now crumbling right in front of my eyes. Wyatt. He. Her voice trailed off, lost in emotion. I turned my back to her, gazing out at the rain-soaked city lights. I love him. Addison's voice, flat and final, froze me in place. Who do you love? My voice was ice cold as I turned to face her. She couldn't answer, her gaze averted, her silence said everything. I don't know, she stammered, curled up on the couch, hugging her knees, her voice trembling like a leaf in a storm. I love you, Asher. I love Wyatt, too. My stomach lurched, and the room spun. I'd never experienced this kind of pain before, this soul-deep betrayal. Don't insult me, I said, my voice tight with barely contained rage. My fist slammed onto the small coffee table, sending the glass tumbling, spilling whiskey over the tablecloth. Addison flinched at the sudden sound and movement. Love? Are you kidding me right now? I asked, my voice rising with each word. Please, just let me explain. She started, but I cut her off. Enough. My voice reverberated through the room, silencing her instantly. She bit back her words, covering her face with her trembling hands, her fingers slick with tears. Leave tonight, I said, the words barely above a whisper, but carrying the full weight of my pain and anger. What? She asked, confused, her voice small. Stay with a friend if you have to. Just leave. My voice was barely audible now. I couldn't bear to look at her any longer. I could see her knees shaking as she slowly stood up. Asher, please. She began, her voice pleading. But I cut her off again. We don't exist anymore, I said, the words final. In the window, I caught a glimpse of my own distorted reflection. A stranger staring back at me. Behind me, Addison gathered her things, picking up her bag and slipping on her shoes, her movements muted and distant, as if from another world. All those memories with you, they were real, she said, her voice filled with a painful longing. Go, was all I could say, my voice hard. The door creaked open, followed by the soft sound of her footsteps fading into the hallway. Then the heavy click of the door shutting, sealing the end of our life together. Silence filled the room. The rain outside seemed to laugh at me, a mocking soundtrack to my despair. The whiskey stain on the tablecloth gleamed darkly under the moonlight, a testament to the chaos that had just erupted. I picked up my phone, the photo of Wyatt's message still there, a cruel taunt. My fingers trembled, poised over the delete button. Deleting it would be easy enough, but I knew the scars on my heart wouldn't fade so simply. I walked over to the bar counter and grabbed another glass, filling it with fresh whiskey over ice. The amber liquid shimmered as I raised it. Tomorrow, I'd face it all. I'd prepare the dissolution of marriage papers, a harsh legal document that would officially mark the end of everything. I'd call the lawyer, get the process started, bring it all to a swift and decisive end. As the ice slowly melted, I accepted the end of 5 years of marriage. But I knew, deep down, that the pain of this night, this betrayal, would never fully vanish. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I watched the fog roll in from the bay, a gray blanket covering the city, as the first hints of dawn painted the sky with a cold, pale light. Addison's faint scent of perfume lingered in the room, a fading reminder of what we had lost, of what I was losing, before finally dissipating into the cold morning air. A week. 7 days since she walked out, and the apartment felt like a tomb. I couldn't stay away any longer. My footsteps echoed through the sterile hospital hallway, each step matching the heavy thump of my heart. I had to see her. We needed to talk. The finance wing's glass-walled conference room was slightly ajar, voices spilling out. One voice I knew instantly. Wyatt's. "You're really something special, Addison." His tone, sickeningly smooth, made my jaw clench. I froze, peering through the crack in the door. Wyatt. Tall, impeccably groomed. The doctor, with a predatory gaze, stood too close to Addison, his head tilted, his voice dripping with a false sweetness. Anger, hot and sharp, pricked at my skin. How easily he'd inserted himself into my life, into her life. "But Asher." Addison's voice, soft, trembling, reached me. She stood by the window, arms crossed, her usual bright expression replaced by something worn, haunted. "Does he really understand you?" Wyatt's words were calculated, hitting like carefully placed darts. "Your talents, your dreams, everything that makes you who you are, he's just an architect, Addison. His world is nothing like yours." My fists tightened, nails digging into my palms. Wyatt's words were manipulative, widening the rift between us. And Addison, she wasn't pushing back, wasn't arguing. She was absorbing his poison. He's been acting strange lately, looking at my phone, watching me. Addison's voice wavered, her gaze dropping, almost in shame. "Of course he's suspicious. He doesn't trust you, Addison. You're just something he owns, something he can control." Wyatt's whispers were poison, slowly and surely infecting her mind. He moved closer, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Addison looked up at him, eyes glistening, a broken shadow I barely recognized. "You need freedom, Addison. You deserve it." His voice softened, his hand reaching towards her hair, gently brushing a lock behind her ear. Addison didn't flinch, didn't resist, and my chest tightened at the seam, the magnetic pull he had over her. I don't know anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her face, usually bright and confident, now seemed broken, lost. Wyatt, with his manipulative charm, was preying on her every crack. "You don't have to know," he murmured. "I'll guide you." I tore myself away, my footsteps heavy as I left the hospital. Each word, each touch, replayed in my mind, twisting the knife. In just a week, Addison had ignored my calls and texts, and yesterday, a blue envelope had landed on my desk, thick with a weight of finality. Inside, the dissolution of marriage papers sat, mocking me from my desk. Untouched, unsigned, they felt like a final declaration. I stumbled back to my downtown office, dropping into my ergonomic chair. Blueprint drafts and concept sketches littered the desk, but I couldn't focus. My phone buzzed, jarring me from the haze. Zoe's name flashed. Addison's closest friend, a nurse here too. She'd been reaching out, whispers of support. "Asher," she said, her voice strained, urgent. "What is it?" I asked, a foreboding tension crawling up my spine. "It's Addison. There's something I have to tell you. She's been moving funds from the hospital accounts." "What?" My grip on the phone tightened. Wyatt told her to. He's made her shift large sums into a separate account. A chill settled over me. Since when? 3 months ago. It started small. But recently, it's huge, Asher. 3 months. The same time that Addison's changes began. The late nights, the lies. It all clicked. Wyatt's influence, Addison's decline, and now stolen money. How much are we talking about? Over $5 million. My stomach dropped, leaving me nauseous. Addison wasn't just caught in a lie. She was drowning in a trap of Wyatt's making. "Do you have proof?" "Yes," Zoe said, her tone unwavering. "I've been suspicious for weeks, so I've been keeping copies of records. I can show you everything. Can we meet?" "Now?" 30 minutes. At the park behind the hospital. I hung up, my eyes settling on the unsigned dissolution of marriage papers again. Addison's name was scrawled in her familiar handwriting, a painful reminder of everything we had. Her signature waited for mine, a final agreement to end it all. My hand trembled as I traced her name, the ink blurred by the unsteady lines of my vision. I felt a pull to those papers, not as documents but as the end of a dream. 30 minutes later, I found Zoe on a park bench, a thick file clutched tightly. She scanned the area before handing me the folder, her eyes intense, carrying a blend of worry and anger. "This." She pointed at the records, her voice taut. "Transaction logs, account numbers, everything. Each one verified, every detail meticulously recorded." I flipped through the pages, each entry like a dagger, each amount moved, each date, proof of Wyatt's manipulation. "He targeted her, Asher," Zoe said, her voice breaking. "He used her vulnerabilities, her insecurities. Slowly, step by step, he twisted everything about her. Has Addison noticed? What has he told her?" "He's been dosing her, Asher. Anxiety medication. No prescription." My grip tightened around the folder. "What?" "Quiet." Zoe's eyes darted around, lowering her voice. "He's giving her pills. First, he said they were for stress, but now she's distant, unfocused. It's like he's breaking her from the inside." I took a deep breath, forcing the anger to settle. Wyatt had crossed a line I could never forgive. "I found discrepancies in the pharmacy records, too," Zoe continued. "Pills unaccounted for, not in any system. He's been covering his tracks." As the autumn wind swirled leaves around our feet, Zoe looked at me, her expression dark and resolute. "There's one more thing you need to know, Asher. Addison still." Before she could finish, Zoe's phone rang. Her face went white as she glanced at the caller ID. Zoe's face went ashen as she stared at her ringing phone. She took a shaky breath, glancing at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and apprehension before answering it. "Yes?" Her voice was barely audible, a strained whisper. As she listened, her eyes widened, and I could see the tension in her shoulders growing with each passing second, her body becoming more rigid. I understand. I'll be there as soon as possible. She ended the call, her hand lingering on the phone, staring off into the distance, her expression troubled and distant. What happened? I demanded, my voice low but urgent, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. Zoe turned to me, her eyes wide with worry, a flicker of fear in their depths. That was the hospital. Addison just collapsed during her shift. What? My heart seized, the world around me suddenly narrowing to just those few terrifying words. Is she all right? What happened? They didn't say much, Zoe replied, her voice shaking slightly, revealing the depth of her concern. Just that she lost consciousness, and that they're running tests. I have to get back there immediately. Without a second thought, I started moving with her towards the hospital, my mind racing, filled with a chaotic mix of fear and anger. Addison collapsing? It couldn't be a coincidence. Not after everything I had learned from Zoe. Not after everything that had happened in the past week. Wyatt's insidious influence, the unprescribed drugs he'd been giving her, it all pointed directly at him. Anger simmered in my chest, bubbling close to the surface as we hurried through the park, weaving between people, our footsteps heavy with urgency and a sense of foreboding. The hospital was only a few blocks away, but each step felt like an eternity. By the time we reached the entrance, my pulse was pounding in my ears, a mixture of fear and raw fury surging through me. We entered the familiar building, the antiseptic smell of the place hitting me like a physical blow, and Zoe quickly led the way to the emergency department, where Addison had been taken. At the reception desk, Zoe spoke quickly to the nurse on duty, her voice tight with worry. The nurse nodded and gestured down the hall, her face sympathetic. 214, the nurse said, her tone softening slightly. She's stable for now, but they're still trying to determine the cause of the collapse. We rushed down the hallway towards the room, my mind spinning with unanswered questions and a growing sense of dread. When we finally entered, I saw Addison lying on the hospital bed, her face pale and drawn against the stark white sheets, her breathing shallow and uneven. Machines beeped quietly beside her, monitoring her vital signs, each sound a stark reminder of how fragile she looked, how different she seemed from the vibrant, confident person I once knew. I stood by her bedside, clenching my fists as I looked at her, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the strain etched into her features. Wyatt had done this to her. I knew it. He'd broken her down, piece by piece, exploiting her vulnerabilities until there was nothing left. The image of the unsigned dissolution of marriage papers flashed through my mind, adding a layer of pain to my already heavy heart, a constant reminder of the precariousness of my own life. Suddenly, the door opened, and Wyatt stepped into the room, his expression calm, almost too composed, his eyes betraying nothing but a cold, unsettling calmness. His gaze swept over Zoe and me, a slight, almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. What are you doing here, Asha? His tone was casual, dismissive, as if he hadn't been the one to push Addison to the absolute breaking point. What did you give her, Wyatt? I demanded, my voice barely controlled, each word sharp with barely contained rage, the words practically vibrating in the sterile air. What have you been doing to her? Wyatt's smirk deepened, his eyes gleaming with a cold amusement that made my blood boil. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "Addison's stress has been overwhelming her recently, and I've simply offered her guidance, support," he added, his tone dripping with a false concern. I took a step toward him, fists clenched, my body aching to lash out. "Guidance? You've been manipulating her, controlling her? She's in this hospital bed because of you," I accused him, my voice rising with each word, my anger threatening to spill over. Wyatt chuckled, an infuriatingly calm sound that only fueled my rage. "Oh, Asher, you're always so quick to blame others. Maybe you should ask yourself why she needed my support in the first place." Zoe stepped forward, her voice shaking with a raw anger that matched my own. "I know what you've been doing, Wyatt. I've seen the records, the unauthorized prescriptions. You've been giving her drugs without her consent, isolating her from us. And now this?" She gestured to Addison's still form on the bed, her voice filled with disgust. "You can't hide what you've done anymore." Wyatt's face hardened, the amusement fading from his eyes as he realized that we weren't backing down. "Be careful with your accusations," he warned, his voice low and almost threatening. "You have absolutely no proof of any wrongdoing." Zoe's gaze was steady and defiant, her eyes flashing with a determination that I found reassuring. "We have more than enough proof, and we're going to expose you for everything you've done to her, I promise." Wyatt's jaw tightened, his confidence faltering for just a moment before he quickly regained his composure. "Believe what you want." Addison came to me for support, and I gave it to her. If she needed medication, that was her choice, not mine, he stated, a lie that sounded so practiced and smooth. "Enough with the lies," I snapped, unable to hold back any longer, my voice vibrating with fury. "I know you've been manipulating her, turning her against me, isolating her from everyone who cared about her. But it ends right here, right now." Wyatt looked at me with a cold disdain, his eyes narrowed. "Is that so? And what do you plan to do, Asher? Run to the police? 'Cause a scene?" "Believe me," I replied, my voice unwavering, my eyes locked with his. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect her from you, and I will not stop until you pay for what you've done." A tense silence filled the room, broken only by the quiet beeping of the machines that were monitoring Addison's fragile state. Wyatt's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite read, a shadow of unease that quickly vanished. Without another word, he turned and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving a void of anger and fear in their wake. I let out a shaky breath, the weight of the confrontation settling heavily over me. Zoe placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, her gaze steady and resolute. "We'll get him, Asher," she said softly, her voice filled with a fierce determination. "We'll make sure he pays for everything he's done to her." I looked down at Addison, her face still pale and still, and felt a surge of determination pulse through me. Wyatt's grip on her life, his insidious influence would end, and I would make absolutely certain of it. The dissolution of marriage papers felt like a distant memory, a forgotten formality in the face of this new, urgent battle. The hospital lights blurred around me as I sat at Addison's bedside, the quiet beeping of the machines the only sound, a constant rhythmic reminder of her fragility. Zoe had gone to talk with the doctors, gathering more information. I was alone with my thoughts, my mind replaying everything that had happened, the anger mixing with fear and a deep sense of loss. I stared at Addison, so peaceful in her sleep, yet she looked fragile, more fragile than I had ever seen her. My mind raced through memories. The laughter we used to share, the dreams we once planned, the ease with which we had once moved through life. How had everything spiraled so far out of control? Wyatt's influence was like a poison, infecting every part of her life, and seeing her here, I knew if I didn't act soon, she might never escape. I clenched my fists, trying to contain the emotions raging inside of me. The unsigned dissolution of marriage papers felt like a physical weight on my chest. Just then, I heard a soft murmur, the sound barely breaking the silence. Addison's eyes fluttered open, her gaze unfocused as she looked around. "Addison?" I leaned closer, relief flooding through me. "Can you hear me?" She blinked, her eyes finally focusing on my face, a faint smile touching her lips. "Asher?" Her voice was weak, barely a whisper. "I'm here," I said softly, taking her hand. "I'm right here." Her smile faded, replaced by confusion and pain. What happened?" "I was at work, and then, I don't remember." "You collapsed," I explained gently, keeping my voice calm. "They brought you here to the hospital to check on you. You've been pushing yourself too hard, Addison. You need to rest." She shook her head, wincing as if the movement caused her physical pain. "I can't rest, Asher. There's too much to do. Wyatt needs me." His name sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to tell her everything, make her see what he'd done, but I knew I had to be careful. She was vulnerable. Pushing too hard might only drive her back. "Addison," I said, keeping my voice soft, "I know you feel like you owe him something, but you don't. He's taken advantage of you. You deserve so much better." She pulled her hand away. Her eyes narrowed, a slight frown on her face. "Why are you saying that? Wyatt's the only one who's been there for me. He understands me." Frustration welled up inside of me, but I forced myself to remain composed. "Addison, please, just think about everything that has happened since you met him. The isolation, the exhaustion. None of this is normal. He's manipulating you." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought I had gotten through to her, but then she shook her head, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking slightly. "You don't understand, Asha. You don't know what it's like. He's helped me when no one else would." "Addison," I said, my voice softening, gently reaching out to lower her hands from her face. "I know it feels like that, but it's not real. Wyatt's help came with a price. He's been controlling you, using you for his own gain. I just want you to be free from him." She stared at me, her expression a mix of doubt and pain, and I could see her trying to understand what I was saying. "Free? I don't even know what that feels like anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My heart ached as I looked at her, realizing just how deep Wyatt's hold on her had become. He had made her believe she needed him, that she couldn't survive without his guidance, his control. I took a deep breath, knowing I had to give her space, but feeling desperate to reach her, desperate to save her. I remembered the dissolution of marriage papers and their meaninglessness in this moment. Before I could say anything else, Zoe returned to the room, holding a clipboard with the test results. She glanced between us, her face serious. "They've done some tests," she said, addressing Addison directly, her voice calm. "Addison, they found traces of an unprescribed sedative in your system. That's likely what caused you to collapse." Addison looked at her in confusion. "A sedative? I didn't take any medication like that." Zoe's eyes met mine, and I could see a determination in her gaze. "It's possible someone else has been administering it to you without your knowledge, Addison." I watched Addison's face as the realization began to dawn on her. Her gaze turned inward, confusion giving way to disbelief, and then to a flicker of horror. Her face looked pale and drawn. "Wyatt." Her voice was barely audible, trembling with uncertainty and fear. "We don't have proof it was him," Zoe replied carefully, keeping her tone neutral. "But I think it's something you should consider. You deserve to know the truth." Addison's face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I reached out, placing a comforting hand on her back as she cried, feeling her world unravel in front of her. She didn't resist this time, leaning into the comfort, as if the weight of the truth was finally too much for her to bear alone. Zoe and I exchanged a look, a silent promise passing between us. We would protect Addison. We would stand by her as she confronted the truth, no matter how painful it was. And together, we would help her reclaim the life Wyatt had tried to steal from her. The dissolution of marriage papers for the moment had no meaning at all. There were more pressing things to worry about. The days after Addison's revelation were a blur of strained silences and cautious conversations. She was discharged from the hospital, and Zoe and I took her back to her apartment. But I could see the toll this was taking on her. She was like a ghost, a shadow of her former self, caught between the life she'd known with Wyatt and the harsh reality we were showing her. Breaking free wouldn't be easy, but I was more determined than ever to see her through this. One evening, Zoe and I sat across from Addison in her living room, carefully going over everything she remembered about her time with Wyatt. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, her fingers clenching a cup of tea she hadn't touched, her movements slow and deliberate. The room was quiet, heavy with unspoken fears. "I just don't understand." Addison's voice cracked, and she shook her head, her face a mask of confusion and disbelief. I really thought he cared about me." Zoe reached over and put a gentle hand on her arm. "Addison, people like Wyatt know how to make you feel that way. They manipulate, they isolate, making you believe that you need them. It's all part of their control, and it's not your fault at all." Addison looked down, her shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed on her hands. "I guess I let it happen, didn't I? I ignored all of the signs, everything that was in front of me." "It's not your fault," I said firmly, my voice sharp but full of support. "People like Wyatt are skilled at what they do. They know how to hide their true intentions. What really matters is that you see it now, that you're willing to take steps to protect yourself and to move forward." She gave a small nod, but I could see the doubt still lingering in her eyes. She was afraid, unsure if she could move on without Wyatt's influence. But I also saw a flicker of something else, a small ember of hope beginning to ignite. "We'll be here for you," I assured her, meeting her gaze directly. "You don't have to do this alone. Zoe and I will be right beside you, helping you with whatever you need." Just then, Addison's phone buzzed on the table, making all of us jump. She glanced at the screen, her face going white, all the color draining from her cheeks. "It's him," she whispered, her hand trembling as she looked at Wyatt's name on the display. Her body stiffened. Zoe reached over and turned the phone face down, cutting off the jarring sound. "You don't have to answer that, Addison," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "But what if he knows something? What if he tries to find me?" she asked, her voice tight with fear, her eyes darting around as if she expected him to appear at any moment. The fear in her voice was palpable, and I felt a surge of anger toward Wyatt for the grip he still had on her, even from a distance. I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm for Addison's sake. I thought of the dissolution of marriage papers and the emptiness they represented. "Listen to me," I said softly, leaning forward to meet her gaze. "Wyatt's power over you only exists as long as you let it. If he tries to contact you, if he tries to manipulate you again, you don't have to engage. You have us now. We'll protect you." Addison swallowed, looking down at her hands, the fingers twisting together. She nodded slowly, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she murmured, her voice barely audible, a confession laced with self-doubt. "He made me believe I needed him, that I couldn't function without him, that I was nothing without him." Zoe's eyes softened, and she leaned closer, her tone gentle but resolute. "Strength isn't about never feeling afraid. It's about finding the courage to stand up, even when you're terrified. You've already taken the first step, Addison. You reached out to us. You're so much stronger than you think you are." Addison's eyes filled with tears again, but she managed a small, shaky smile, a small sign of hope, a small flicker of defiance. I need time. I need time to figure out who I am without him and what I want for myself." "And that's perfectly okay," I said, offering a genuine smile. "Take all the time you need. We're not going anywhere. We will always be here for you." The tension in the room slowly eased, and Addison took a deep breath, seeming to relax for the first time in days. She was starting to see she wasn't alone, that she had people who cared about her, and that she was worthy of love and support. Wyatt's grip on her was loosening, little by little, her own strength beginning to rise to the surface. As the evening went on, we started talking more about her future, about the things she wanted to do once she felt ready to move forward. Zoe suggested small, manageable goals to help her rebuild her confidence, hobbies she used to love, places she'd always wanted to visit. The conversation grew lighter, and for the first time, I saw a glimmer of the old Addison, the one I knew and loved before Wyatt entered her life. By the time we left her apartment that night, I felt a cautious sense of optimism, a fragile hope beginning to bloom. Addison still had a long road ahead, but she was finally beginning to find herself again, piece by piece. And I knew, as I walked out the door with Zoe by my side, that we would be there for her every step of the way, no matter how difficult things became, that we would never let her go through any of this alone again. The dissolution of marriage papers felt like they belonged to another world now, a world that was quickly fading away as a new world was starting to take its place. Zoe turned to me as we reached the street, her eyes shining with a fierce determination. "We're going to get her through this, Asher. I know we are," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. I nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, we are. Wyatt won't have any power over her by the time we're done. I promise you that. As we walked away, I glanced up at the apartment building, feeling a sense of growing hope within me. Addison was finally on the path to freedom, and together we'd make sure that nothing and no one could ever take that away from her. Days turned into a tense week. The apartment, now a shared space between Zoe and Addison, felt charged with a quiet anger. Addison, stronger now, worked with Zoe to piece together the fragments of her financial and emotional abuse, but the air hung heavy with the unspoken. We all knew Wyatt wouldn't simply disappear. The dissolution of marriage papers felt like a cruel joke. One evening, a call came. Addison's voice was tight. "He's at the hospital, Asher. He wants to talk." My blood ran cold. This wasn't a request. This was a challenge. I met Zoe's gaze, her expression resolute. It was time. The hospital corridor was eerily quiet. The sterile smell hung heavy, a reminder of Addison's collapse. I found Wyatt in his office, leaning back in his chair, a smug look on his face. "Asher," he said, his voice calm. Too calm. "I was expecting you." "What did you expect, Wyatt? A handshake?" My voice was low, controlled. "I came here for answers." He chuckled, the sound grating. "Answers? About what? About how she was so easy to manipulate?" He glanced out of the window for a moment, as if the subject was a minor annoyance. "About how you drugged her, stole from the hospital, and tried to destroy her life." The words came out sharp, each one a strike. "Addison. She's always been fragile. I was merely helping her cope," Wyatt replied with a smooth, dismissive tone that made my fists clench. "You couldn't provide her with what she needed, Asher." "So, I did." My fist slammed onto his desk, the sound echoing through the small office. Wyatt didn't flinch. He had a calculated composure that made my skin crawl. "You're a predator, Wyatt," I said, my voice shaking with suppressed rage. "A liar, a thief, and a manipulator. This isn't about helping anyone. This is about you and your control." "Control?" Wyatt leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "It's about knowing what people really want, what they truly need. Addison was a broken toy waiting to be fixed. You couldn't do it. I could." The sheer arrogance of his words fueled my anger further. "You didn't fix her, Wyatt. You broke her. You almost destroyed everything." "Oh, but I am quite good at what I do, Asher." "And if she had just stayed with me, she would have seen that," Wyatt said with a smirk. "Maybe you are not good enough for her. Maybe she needed someone like me." I lunged across the desk, grabbing him by his collar. "You will never touch her again." I held him so that my face was inches from his. Wyatt just laughed. "What are you going to do, Asher? Turn me over to the police? They don't have the proof they need, and frankly, neither do you." "We have everything we need," I said, my voice a cold whisper. "And what happens now is my choice." I pushed him back, a calculating anger coursing through me. At that moment, the door opened, and Addison stepped in, her gaze locked on Wyatt, with Zoe just behind her. Her expression, no longer fragile, was a mask of cold fury. She held out a small device, a memory stick. "I was recording our conversations, Wyatt." "Every word," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. Every lie, every manipulation, it's all here. Wyatt's face paled. He looked at the memory stick and then back at Addison. How could you? He muttered, his arrogance finally faltering. Addison's eyes were blazing. Because you underestimated me, Wyatt. You thought I was weak, but I'm not. We're not. I released Wyatt, stepping back, letting Addison take the lead. Her voice, though still containing an edge of sadness, showed a newfound strength. You thought you could control me, but you were wrong. You will never control me or anyone else again, and I think it is time for you to pay the price. Wyatt stared at the device in Addison's hand, his face contorted with panic. I just smiled, a cold, hard smile that did not reach my eyes. The authorities were swift. Wyatt was arrested, the evidence overwhelming. The hospital, reeling from the scandal, launched a full investigation. The stolen funds were recovered, and Addison's name was cleared. The dissolution of marriage papers still sat on my desk, a reminder of the past. But now, they held no real meaning. Addison and I didn't talk much about what we had experienced. The silence that once held tension was replaced by an understanding, a shared experience of having faced the darkness together. She focused on healing, on rebuilding her life, her career, and reconnecting with those she'd lost. Zoe stood by her side, unwavering and strong. One afternoon, I found Addison in the living room, gazing out at the city. She turned as I came in, her gaze soft. I wanted to say thank you, Asher, she said, her voice gentle but firm. For everything. I nodded, unsure of what to say. You didn't deserve any of this, Addison. And you are strong. You are stronger than I ever thought. She walked over to me, looking up with her piercing blue eyes. I know that now. Thank you for being there, and for being honest with me when I couldn't be with myself. I know it couldn't have been easy to face what I had become and what I had done. She paused, a hint of sadness in her eyes. What does that mean for us, Asher? I looked at her, at the strength and resilience she had found, at the woman she was becoming. I shook my head. We are different people now, Addison, and I think that the future for us is to go on separate paths. This doesn't change what we were, but it changes who we are, and that is more than enough. A small smile appeared on her face as she nodded her head. It is. A long moment of silence passed between us. Then Addison turned back to the window, gazing out at the skyline, the city lights no longer blurred by rain or deception, but shimmering with a future that was yet to be written. The dissolution of marriage papers still sat on my desk, a stark reminder of what had been. They felt like a relic from a different life. I glanced at a framed photograph beside them, Addison and me from long ago, our faces filled with the easy laughter and love of the past. Looking at that photo, I couldn't help but feel a sense of both loss and a faint, distant hope. Maybe, I thought, a new chapter is waiting to be written for both of us, although apart.